welcome to our Whitefish Legacy Partners Kids Watershed Discovery live stream. We're sorry we're running a few minutes late. This is all new to us, as I'm sure it is to many of us. So welcome. And if you're joining us late, that's no problem. You can go ahead and rewind the video, or you can come and watch it at any time that's convenient for you. So welcome. We'll just give folks a couple minutes to join. And if you have any questions during this, you can just go into the comments section there on Facebook, and we'll do our best to answer them. So today we're going to be talking about watersheds and the water cycle. And a lot of you kids in school might have learned about this in your classrooms, but we might be talking about things in a bit of a different way. And we've also got the school watershed model here to use while we are talking about it. So the first thing to think about is when any precipitation, and that's any rain or snow that falls on the ground, that rain has two places to go, that water has two places to go. One thing that can happen is it can soak down into the ground. And once it's soaked down into the ground, maybe it will get sucked up by a tree or a plant that will use that water to live. But it can also soak down deeper into the ground, and then it becomes groundwater. And that's water that's stored in the ground in what is called an aquifer. And if you've ever been to the beach, and imagine if you fill up a bucket full of sand all the way to the top, and then you start pouring in water, you can actually pour a lot of water into that bucket, even though it already looked like it was full of sand. And that's because that water can go into the little spaces in between all the different grains of sand. And that's just how an aquifer works. That's where all that water, that groundwater that's stored underground, goes. So when precipitation falls on the ground, it can either soak in as groundwater or it can run off on the surface of the ground. And we call all of that water that runs off surface water. So that's any precipitation that doesn't soak down into the ground, that's going to run down the ground. And when that happens, that water always is pretty predictable. It always runs downhill because of gravity. So when that water runs downhill, first it's going to collect in tiny little streams, and then those small streams are going to run together into bigger streams, which might run into rivers and might run into lakes. And so all that water is going to collect as it runs downhill. So it'll start out in a small stream, and that'll get bigger and bigger and bigger until it's some of the biggest rivers that we have. Whitefish Lake, which is the lake that's in most of our backyards, has a lot of streams running into it. So if you've ever been out around on Whitefish Lake, you'll see those streams coming in. There's Helvering Stream, or Helvering Creek, there's Brush Creek, there's Smith Creek, there's just a ton of creeks. And that's where a lot of the water that's in Whitefish Lake is coming from. It's flowing down in those creeks. And a lot of those creeks, all of those creeks that I just mentioned, start high up in the mountains. So if you've ever been skiing up at the resort and you've gone skiing in Helvering Basin, all of that snow that you're skiing on, when it melts in the spring, this time of year, a lot of that's going to flow into Helvering Creek. And it's going to collect as it flows into Helvering Creek, and eventually it's going to come into Whitefish Lake. And so we would say that Helvering Basin is part of Whitefish Lake's watershed. That's because all of that area up there in Helvering Basin, all the water that falls on that drains down into Whitefish Lake. And that's exactly what a watershed is. It is the land where all the rain or precipitation that falls on it collects into one place. That could be in a river or in a lake. So every river and lake has a watershed. And sometimes you'll have a watershed that's inside of another watershed. So if we think about that water coming from Halvering Basin, it flows into Halvering Creek, then it flows into Whitefish Lake, but then from Whitefish Lake, it flows out the Whitefish River into the Flathead River, and then into Flathead Lake. So the Whitefish Lake watershed is actually inside of the Flathead Lake watershed. And that happens a lot of times, that we can talk about the watershed just for a small area, or there can be a huge watershed, like the Mississippi River watershed is a huge part of our country. So every river and lake has a watershed, and one watershed can actually be inside of another watershed. So why does all this matter? So we've been talking about what is a watershed. So here we have a model of a watershed, and we're going to say that this is Whitefish. So here we have Whitefish Lake all down here. Maybe this is City Beach here. And then we have creeks that are running into it, and one collects from over here, one collects from over here. And so all of this area that we see is part of the Whitefish Lake watershed. And that includes all these houses we see. So we don't just have the Whitefish Lake, we also have the town of Whitefish. So we have houses here, we have a car parked out here on the street, we even have a farm, and we have all these streets that are paved. So if we're talking about how we can protect a lake like Whitefish Lake, then we also need to be thinking about what happens within all of the Whitefish Lake watershed. So we can see how a watershed here works, that when it starts to rain, and you can see this water is accumulating here in the streets, and then it's starting to flow down into the creek and into the lake. So anywhere it rains on here, all of that water we're going to see is going to end up in the lake. And hopefully you can see that okay. So all of these places, no matter where it is, because it's in the Whitefish Lake watershed, all that water, it might cool here on the street for a little while, but eventually all of that is going and ending up in the river, and then in Whitefish Lake. Oh, rained so hard our tree blew over. Okay, so now that we see how all that's working, you can see all this water that's running down here in the creeks and into the lake. So now we can ask ourselves, what does it matter what all is here in our watershed? So in this watershed, I see we've got a big hotel, we've got a bunch of houses, there's a gas station here, there's a farm over here with a farmhouse. Like I said, we have our car here parked on the road. So if we know that all of the water that falls on this area is going to flow down into the creek and into the into Whitefish Lake, then we can also guess that anything that's on the ground when that rain falls and then runs down is also going to end up in the lake. So let's try that out. We've got some little dye here. So let's start, we've got a car here. So let's imagine this car is parked here outside of somebody's house. Maybe I'll move it a little closer so it's easier for you to see. So we've got a car that's parked here outside of somebody's house. And let's say that that car starts leaking oil or gasoline. And sometimes that happens with our cars and we might not even know it. So let's say that that car leaks some oil and gasoline there onto the road. So maybe there's just like a little oil spot under the car. Nobody even notices it. But then when it rains, let's see where that oil winds up. You can see it running down off the street into this right here, which is a little storm drain, and it is ending up going into the creek and then flowing into Whitefish Lake. So here's a person who's parked on the street. They probably don't even know that their car is leaking oil, but all of that oil and gasoline is ending up down there in the lake. So let's try over here. Let's say that this house here, they want to have a really nice lawn, and they decided to use a kind of chemical that's called an herbicide to put on their lawn that's going to kill all the weeds. So they won't have weeds in their lawn, they'll just have the kind of grass that they want. So now let's say that they've gone ahead and they've spread that herbicide on their lawn. Some of that's going to get soaked up by the grass and the plants and do what they want it to, but some of it is also, when it rains, going to end up going into the creek and then right into the lake. And so that's something that they added to their lawn because they thought that that it was just going to stay on their lawn. They probably didn't think about what was going to happen when it rained. So let's take a minute and think about what are some other things that we might put on the ground that might also end up flushing into our rivers and streams and lakes when it rains. So take a minute and you can shout them out to yourself as you think about them. So some things I thought of was litter. Maybe somebody dropped a candy wrapper on the ground, and when it rains, that candy wrapper is going to end up in the lake too. Another thing that it could happen with is pet waste. So if we don't pick up our dog poop, then that can actually get washed down with the rain also. So maybe you came up with some other good ones too. But one thing that's important to know is that runoff doesn't work the same way everywhere. So if you picture a parking lot or a street that's paved with concrete or pavement, you can imagine how hard that is. And if you've ever seen a big puddle form in the street or your driveway or a parking lot, that's because none of that water can soak down into the ground. It can only run off when it rains. So here in our town, all of this gray that you see here is places where it's paved. So all of this is area where any rain that falls on it is just going to run off because none of it can really soak down. Whereas these places you see that are green, if we have a green place like over here in these people's lawn, some water is going to soak down into that, but not quite as much because when they built the house, they probably compacted all of that ground. So some green places like lawns can absorb some water, but they're still going to have a lot of water running off of them. But then there's other kinds of green spaces like wetlands or forests that can actually soak up a lot of water. Some of that water is going to run into streams like we talked about up in Halvoring Basin. But some of that water, a lot more of it is going to soak down into the ground. And forests and wetlands are actually really good at filtering that water. So those plants can naturally pull out those things like maybe some of the motor oil, maybe something like a pesticide or a fertilizer, that they naturally act like filters. So we're going to try over here. We have a little wetland and forest here. So we're going to add this just to show. So let's imagine here that we have some pollutants that have ended up here in this forest. When it rains, we'll do one over here to compare. So when it rains over here on the street where it's all pavement, you can see right away how all that ends up running down into the stream, and then into the lake. None of it gets soaked in. But over here where our tree is, we can actually spray a lot of water on this. It can hold and store a lot of water before any of it's starting to run off. So you can just see how many sprays I've done and none of that water's running off yet. It's all being held here. You can still see the red where we put that there, but that forest and wetland is really good at holding that for a while, letting some of those chemicals break down before that water flows out. So if we're thinking about with Whitefish Lake, if we want to think about what are reasons that we want to protect Whitefish Lake. So take another minute and think about what your favorite thing is about Whitefish Lake. What's your favorite thing to do there? So we're just going to take a minute. You can shout them out at home. Reasons why you think it's important to protect Whitefish Lake and other lakes like it. It could be Flathead Lake. It could be any of your favorite lakes. So I think it's important that we're protecting Whitefish Lake because I love to swim there. I like to go fishing there. It's also a place that in Whitefish we get some of our drinking water from. We actually pull some water from it and it gets treated and cleaned before it comes out the pipe at your house. So that's another reason. There's also a lot of wildlife in the lake. There's a ton of fish, there's birds, there's plants that live there. So it's really important that we make sure that the water in our rivers and lakes stay clean, both for all of the natural things that live there and for all the ways that we use them. So if we're thinking about how we want to keep Whitefish Lake clean, it also means we need to think about what's happening in all of these areas. And we just heard that Jackson and Lucas want to protect the fish. Me too, Jackson and Lucas. So if we're thinking about how we want to protect the lake, we need to think about what's happening in all of this area. And remember, this area is called our watershed. So all of these things that we saw happening, whether it was the oil leaking out of our car or whether it was the chemicals being put on the lawn, all of those are things that we call non-point source pollutants. And really all that means is it's things that could pollute our waterways, but they don't just come from one place, like from a pipe in a factory. They can come from lots of different places and lots of different people, and they're also really hard to keep track of. So if we're thinking about those non-point source pollutants in our watershed, we know that we're going to be building houses. We're going to be building streets. We're going to be building parking lots. We're going to be building all these places that we know a lot of the water is going to run off from, and we know there could be some pollutants in that water. It's important that as we're building those things, we're also leaving places like this forest and this wetland that are going to help to absorb some of that water. They're going to help to filter some of that out. But there's other reasons why we want to protect those places too. So take a minute, think about other reasons why you think it's important that we might want to protect our forests and wetlands too, not just for what they do with water like this, but for other reasons. So take a minute, think about it, shout it out, or you can also type it into the comments if you want to share it with everybody. Heidi also said that she likes the views that we get to see from Whitefish Lake. So that's another great reason to protect Whitefish Lake, is when we get to go out on it and enjoy all the views from it. So other reasons why I think it's important to protect places like our wetlands and forests is that there's a lot of things living in these, right? So we've got our tree here, but it's also really important wildlife habitat. It's important that all the wildlife that we have has places where they can live, that they have space to do that. So wildlife habitat is one reason. Also, forests like this, in the same way that they help to clean the water, they also help to clean our air. So when we have trees like this, growing either in our neighborhood or in the forest, those trees and those plants are also all the time working like little air filters that help to keep our air clean. So it's important that we're saving spaces where they can grow. And also, I love going out in the forest to recreate. I love going hiking and biking on the out in the forest. And so that's another really important reason why we want to have places like that that we protect. So we can see from our watershed here that as our towns develop, as we build more streets and houses and parking lots, that we're also leaving places like our wetlands and our forests to help do all those things that help us, whether it's cleaning our water, cleaning our air, providing a place for wildlife to live, or giving us a place to go have fun in the forest. So that is our watershed presentation. Let us know if you have any questions. You can go ahead and put them in the comment section there, and we'll do our best to answer them. If you joined us late, you can go rewind back to the beginning if you want. And parents, if you have ideas for other activities like this that you'd love to see, we'd love to do them. So go ahead and send us a message or an email with suggestions. You know, we're all adjusting to how things are these days from having school at home, and so we want to do everything we can for you and your families to provide things like this for you for some fun learning and a fun activity to do. So thanks everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your day. We hope everybody is staying healthy and happy at home.